Before the Crusades began, before banners of faith turned to fire, the world was already divided, not by land, but by longing. Europe slept beneath the weight of 1,000 years of darkness. The great Roman roads that once carried emperors now lay broken, overgrown with moss. In crumbling stone cathedrals, the candles of faith still flickered, but the air smelled of fear as much as devotion. Kings ruled fragments of land no larger than their courage. Peasants plowed the same soil their fathers had bled into, paying tithes to both church and crown. Nobles quarreled for power, yet knelt for salvation. In their prayers lingered exhaustion, a hunger for purpose greater than daily survival. The clergy promised heaven, but could not explain why the earth had grown so cold. Europe, it seemed, had forgotten how to dream. Far beyond the forests of France and the misted hills of England, another world was thriving. Across the deserts and rivers of the East, a civilization of brilliance had risen. The Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Persia. Its cities glittered with light. Its scholars preserved ancient knowledge. Its physicians healed where others prayed. Baghdad's libraries overflowed with wisdom once lost to the West. In Cairo and Damascus, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry flourished. Even in war, their art held grace. Between these two worlds, one fractured and fearful, the other luminous and learned, stood Jerusalem, a city not of wealth but of meaning. For Jews, it was Zion, the eternal home. For Christians, the tomb of Christ, where death itself had been defeated. For Muslims, the place from which the prophet had ascended into the heavens. Three faiths looked upon the same stones and saw their own reflection. And in that reflection, each saw what the other must never possess. Pilgrims from Europe had traveled to Jerusalem for centuries, walking barefoot through deserts, seeking forgiveness or miracles. Some returned with tears of wonder, others returned with stories of insult, robbery, or violence, yet none returned unchanged. Each carried home the scent of the East, of spices, silk, and strange prayers whispered under crescent moons. To those who had never left their villages, Jerusalem became less a city than a dream, a place where heaven touched earth. But dreams have a way of turning into missions, and missions into wars. As the 11th century drew to its close, whispers reached the papal courts of Christendom that the Holy Land was no longer safe for the faithful, that pilgrims were dying upon the road. Whether these tales were truth or embellishment mattered little. In an age that hungered for meaning, such stories were tinder. All that was needed was a spark, and soon one would come from Rome itself. The year was 1095. Across the fields of France, winter winds carried rumors of something new, something holy and dangerous. In towns and monasteries, priests spoke of letters from the East, desperate appeals for help from a distant emperor whose empire was faltering. The Byzantine emperor Alexios Komnenos, besieged by Turkish armies, had sent a plea to Rome. Send warriors not to conquer, but to defend. It was a modest request, but in the hands of Pope Urban II, it became divine thunder. Europe, after centuries of stagnation, was ready to believe in something greater than its own survival. The papacy, too, was hungry, not just for faith, but for unity. The Church had splintered only decades before in the Great Schism of 1054, when Rome and Constantinople excommunicated each other. Now, Urban saw a chance to heal that wound through a shared cause, one that could bind kingdoms and peasants alike beneath the banner of God. So, in late November in a small French town called Clermont, the Pope mounted a platform before a restless crowd of nobles, knights, and priests. The wind was sharp. The crowd stretched beyond the field, their faces lit by the promise of revelation. When Urban began to speak, his voice carried not as command, but as confession, sorrow, awe, and righteous fire woven into one. He painted the East as a world desecrated. He spoke of Christians tortured, churches defiled, pilgrims slaughtered on their way to Jerusalem. He described the holy city itself under the shadow of unbelievers, its sacred stones crying out for rescue. But his voice was not all warning. It was invitation. "Let those who once fought for lords and kings," he cried, "now fight for the Lord himself. Let those who have been robbers become soldiers of Christ." The people fell silent. For a moment, history itself seemed to hold its breath, and then the cry rose, "Deus vult." God wills it. The word spread through the crowd like fire through dry wheat. Men tore pieces of cloth into crosses and sewed them onto their tunics. Some wept, others laughed. All believed. The idea had taken root. To die for God was not only salvation, it was purpose. For centuries, Christianity had preached humility, patience, and forgiveness. Now it offered redemption through violence. Sin washed clean not by repentance, but by crusade. To the poor, it promised heaven. To the ambitious, it promised glory. To the guilty, it promised forgiveness for all sins committed in the service of the cross. It was not merely a sermon, it was an awakening. The effect was immediate and unstoppable. In every village, blacksmiths hammered crosses into shields. Farmers sold their fields for swords they could barely lift. The old and sick begged to be carried east in carts. Priests preached of Jerusalem as if it were paradise itself, the gate between life and eternity. The Pope's call had turned faith into fever, and fever into movement. But Urban's message was more complex than the crowd understood. He had spoken of aiding the Byzantine Christians, not conquering the Muslim world. Yet once unleashed, the emotion of divine mission cannot be contained by doctrine. The Church's words traveled faster than its control. Within months, self-proclaimed prophets like Peter the Hermit were gathering tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and children, not soldiers, but believers, so consumed by devotion they mistook suffering for sanctity. This people's crusade began before the knights were even ready. They marched eastward without provisions, banners waving, barefoot and singing hymns. Along the way, their hunger and fear twisted faith into fanaticism. In the towns of the Rhine Valley, mobs turned against local Jewish communities, the closest enemies of Christ they could find. Thousands were murdered under the same cry that had once inspired unity, Deus vult. By the time these first waves reached the Byzantine frontier, they were starving, disorganized, and vulnerable. The Turks met them swiftly and brutally. Tens of thousands perished near Nicaea, their bodies left unburied beneath the same sun they thought would guide them to heaven. Few returned to tell the tale, yet the deaths did not discourage Europe. They sanctified it. Martyrdom became proof that the mission was real, that the road to salvation was paved in blood. Meanwhile, the true armies of the First Crusade began assembling, knights and nobles from France, Normandy, and Flanders, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Tancred. They were not saints. They were opportunists and warriors whose ambitions found a new vocabulary. To them, the crusade was both a pilgrimage and a conquest, a chance to cleanse the soul and claim a crown. When they set out in 1096, the roads of Europe thundered with hooves and hymns, crosses glimmered in the sunlight, banners bearing Christ's image fluttered above muddy fields, the air reeked of sweat, iron, and incense. Behind the noble columns trailed thousands of commoners, wives, children, merchants, all swept up in the tide of faith and fear. Europe was emptying itself, pouring its pain eastward in one vast, unstoppable tide. For the first time since Rome's fall, all of Western Christendom moved with a single heartbeat. It was not peace that united them, but purpose. Even those who doubted dared not speak. To question the crusade was to question God himself. Every church bell that rang, every psalm that rose into the cold air, became a drumbeat marching toward destiny. In monasteries, monks wrote of miracles appearing in the skies, crosses of light hovering above clouds, blood-red moons glowing like warning lamps. To the faithful, these were signs that heaven itself had blessed their journey. To others, they were omens of something darker, that God had not been summoned, but provoked. And so the march began, toward Jerusalem, toward glory, toward tragedy. The papal word had become flesh, and the flesh was moving east. Men who had never seen the sea would soon cross it. Men who had never left their villages would soon kill in the name of places they could not pronounce. It was not yet war, but the beginning of an idea that would echo through centuries, that salvation could be taken by the sword. The winter after Clermont did not end in snow. It ended in motion. From every corner of Europe, they began to move, the roads filled with pilgrims and warriors alike, peasants in rags, nobles in mail, monks carrying relics, children dragging wooden crosses. The clang of iron shoes mingled with hymns in Latin and the creak of wagons. It was less an army than an exodus, the poor walking beside the powerful, all bound by the same burning conviction that God himself waited at the end of the road. No one had ever attempted such a journey. The distance between France and Jerusalem stretched across mountains, rivers, and empires, over 2,000 miles of hostile terrain. Yet they walked as though heaven itself paved their path. Chroniclers wrote that the air trembled with psalms, but beneath the songs, fear whispered, fear of the unknown, of hunger, of what faith might cost when gold and strength ran out. The first great hosts marched east under banners stitched with the sign of the cross. Among them were lords whose names would echo through legend: Godfrey of Bouillon, solemn and pious; Bohemond of Taranto, cunning and ambitious; Raymond of Toulouse, wealthy and weary of sin. They were knights, yes, but also businessmen of salvation, each bargaining with heaven for redemption through war. Behind them trailed tens of thousands who owned nothing but belief. Some carried their children on their backs. Others dragged relics of saints, convinced they would open gates and part seas. Crossing the Danube, they entered lands where their language failed them. Hunger became prayer, prayer became delirium. In the villages of Hungary and Bulgaria, supplies dwindled. Suspicion turned to violence. What began as pilgrimage quickly curdled into looting and bloodshed. Many crusaders, starving and desperate, pillaged the same Christian settlements they claimed to defend. To the locals, these pilgrims of God looked no different from invading armies. By the time they reached Constantinople, the shining city of the East, the Emperor Alexios Komnenos looked upon them with unease. He had asked for mercenaries, not multitudes. From the walls of his capital he saw a sea of tents stretching to the horizon. They were supposed to be allies, yet their discipline hung by a thread. Rumors spread that they would sack the city itself if denied food or gold. Alexios, calculating and cautious, ferried them across the Bosporus quickly, eager to send them onward, away from his gates and deeper into the Turkish frontier. And there, the pilgrimage finally became war. The first great clash came at Nicaea in 1097. The city, once Byzantine, had fallen to the Seljuk Turks, formidable horsemen who fought not with faith but with strategy. The Crusaders besieged the walls, their camp ringing with trumpets and psalms. For weeks they hurled stones and prayers in equal measure. When Nicaea finally fell, it was not by their strength alone, but through secret negotiation. The Byzantines had reclaimed the city through diplomacy, while the Crusaders fought at its gates. Many soldiers felt betrayed, cheated of their victory. The first seeds of resentment between East and West had been sown. From Nicaea, the march pressed on through Anatolia, a land of fire and thirst. The summer sun burned through armor, horses died first, then men. Chroniclers tell of soldiers drinking their own blood to survive, of mothers burying their children beneath stones too hot to touch. The Turks struck like ghosts, swift, invisible, vanishing into dust. At Dorylaeum, the Crusaders nearly perished, surrounded and outnumbered. Only the sudden arrival of reinforcements turned massacre into miracle. When the smoke cleared, the victors knelt among corpses and thanked God for what they mistook as divine favor, not desperate luck. As months became years, the Crusaders marched deeper into the East, leaving behind a trail of bones. Those who survived starvation in battle carried their wounds like badges of faith. They began to believe that suffering itself was proof of sanctity, that each hardship was a sign God still watched. Yet beneath that faith lay another force, pride. The longer they marched, the less they resembled pilgrims, and the more they resembled conquerors. Their goal was no longer merely to reach Jerusalem, it was to possess it. In Antioch, the test of faith became unbearable. The siege dragged on for nearly a year. Famine drove them to eat horseflesh, leather, even grass. Men dug graves not for the dead, but for shade from the sun. Priests promised visions of saints marching beside them. When at last they breached the city's walls, their joy turned to horror. Turkish reinforcements arrived within days, trapping the Crusaders inside what had become a tomb of their own making. Then came the relic. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had seen St. Andrew in a dream, who revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. They dug beneath the cathedral floor, and there, in the dirt, found a spearhead. Was it real? No one knew, but belief does not wait for evidence. The relic became miracle, and miracle became momentum. The soldiers, half dead with hunger, surged from the gates shouting, "God wills it!" And against all odds, they won. To the survivors, the victory was proof that heaven still fought beside them. To others, it was delirium sanctified. When at last they resumed their march, the survivors were no longer an army of Europe. They were creatures remade by faith and famine. Their eyes burned with the same fire that had once lit Clermont's field. The dream of Jerusalem drove them onward, a mirage that shimmered through pain. Behind them, entire generations had vanished. Ahead, the horizon glowed like promise. They were walking toward a city they had never seen but believed they already knew. A place where sin would be washed away, where dust would turn to gold, and where the weary would look upon the tomb of God and finally rest. But faith that burns too long becomes hunger, and hunger, when sanctified, becomes something far more dangerous. The Crusaders had survived the deserts and mountains. Now only one thing remained between them and their promise: Jerusalem itself. And in that final approach, the line between faith and fanaticism would disappear completely. By the summer of 1019, after 3 years of marching through fire, famine, and death, the Crusaders finally saw it: Jerusalem, a city of stone and light rising from the desert like a mirage made real. Its walls shimmered under the sun, its domes blazed like gold. Some fell to their knees the moment it appeared on the horizon. Others wept openly, unable to believe that after thousands of miles of misery, the city of God was real. They approached barefoot, singing hymns. The sound echoed across the plains. Te Deum laudamus, we praise you, O God. But what began as prayer soon became preparation, because between them and paradise stood the Saracen defenders, hardened soldiers of the Fatimid Caliphate, waiting behind walls thicker than hope. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, surrounded by steep valleys and stone ramparts. Food and water were scarce. The land had been stripped bare by siege and sun. The Crusaders, reduced to perhaps 12,000, were exhausted, sunburned, half-starved, yet they believed that if they died here, heaven itself would open. The irony was unbearable. They came to reclaim the city of peace, and in doing so, would make it a graveyard. For 40 days they circled the city like wolves around a wounded animal. They built siege towers from dismantled ships, dragged them across the desert piece by piece. When the wells ran dry, they drank dew from their armor. Men collapsed and rose again, whispering Christ's name as if it were water. The priests urged them on, promising visions and indulgences. They carried relics in procession, barefoot under the noonday sun. Some walked naked, believing humility would bend heaven's will. Others dipped their swords in holy oil, believing violence could be sanctified. Inside the city, the defenders prepared just as fiercely. Arrows darkened the sky. Boiling oil poured from ramparts. Every gate became an altar of fire. From both sides rose the same prayer: for victory, for survival, for God to prove himself. And perhaps in the wind that blew through the battlefield, he remained silent, unwilling to claim either side. Then came July 15th, the day the gates broke. From the north, Godfrey's tower touched the wall. From the south, Raymond of Toulouse's men breached the gates of Zion. Trumpets sounded, bells clanged, and with one final cry, Deus vult! The Crusaders poured into Jerusalem. What followed was not deliverance. It was apocalypse. The slaughter began without hesitation. Muslim soldiers fought to the last. Civilians ran to mosques for refuge. But the frenzy of 3 years of hunger, fear, and faith could not be restrained. The chroniclers of the crusade, themselves priests, wrote that the streets ran with blood up to the ankles of the horses. No one was spared, not women, not children, not the elderly. The very city they had come to sanctify was baptized instead in fire and despair. The Al-Aqsa Mosque once a place of prayer, became a killing ground. The dome of the rock, shining under the sun, was claimed as the new temple of the Lord. Crusaders stripped the gilded dome of its crescent and replaced it with a cross. They wept as they sang hymns, believing the carnage beneath them was divine justice. Some knelt in the pools of blood, kissing the stones, thanking God that He had granted them victory. Even in their horror, they believed themselves holy. The irony was unbearable. Men who had marched for salvation mistook slaughter for redemption. The walls of Jerusalem, which had once echoed with the prayers of three faiths, now heard only screams and smoke. The sun rose over a city both liberated and destroyed. When dawn came the next morning, silence fell across the ruins. The smell of burning flesh lingered. The Crusaders, now conquerors, bathed themselves in the tears of victory. They marched barefoot to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ's tomb lay. They laid down their weapons, fell to their knees, and prayed through the blood still clinging to their armor. It was the most human of contradictions. Men who had killed in the name of mercy, now weeping in gratitude to the God of love. To them, Jerusalem was reclaimed. To the world, it had been lost again. In the following weeks, the new rulers divided their spoils. Godfrey of Bouillon, humble in victory, refused to be called king, declaring himself merely defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Yet his followers crowned him in spirit, and the kingdom of Jerusalem was born, fragile, foreign, drenched in righteousness and guilt. The survivors rebuilt churches, buried the dead, and began carving out what they believed was God's will on earth. But not everyone saw heaven in their triumph. The Byzantines, who had asked for aid, watched from afar in shock. The Crusaders had not restored the East, they had claimed it, and in the lands of Islam, the news spread like wildfire. Jerusalem had fallen. The unthinkable had happened. The sacred city, beloved by prophets, had been taken by men whose prayers smelled of smoke. In mosques, from Damascus to Cairo, the imams wept and called for unity. For the first time in centuries, rival emirs, once divided by ambition, began to remember they shared one faith, one cause. Out of defeat was born resolve. The crescent, humbled, began to sharpen. The world had changed. For the Crusaders, Jerusalem was the end of a pilgrimage. For the Muslims, it was the beginning of a jihad. The same stones now carried two opposing truths, each side convinced that God was theirs alone. At night, under the same sky, both prayed for peace, one in Latin, one in Arabic. And somewhere, perhaps, the stars listened in silence, shining equally upon the victors and the dead. History would remember the First Crusade as both miracle and massacre. It was proof of what faith could achieve and what it could destroy. The pilgrims had reached their holy city, but in doing so, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The blood spilled on those stones would echo for centuries, shaping kings, empires, and the very idea of God in the West. And as dawn rose over Jerusalem's quiet streets, one truth hung in the air. No victory bought with innocence can ever be complete. The same walls that once divided believer from infidel would one day divide memory itself. The cross now gleamed above the dome. Bells replaced the call to prayer, but beneath those stones, the silence of the dead told a different story, a story that had only just begun. When the smoke of conquest thinned, Jerusalem stood quiet. Its walls, once smeared with blood, now shimmered under the desert sun like a wound slowly scabbing over. The Crusaders who survived the siege wandered its narrow streets in disbelief. Some wept in prayer before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, others touched the stones as if to confirm they were real. They had arrived not as pilgrims now, but as rulers, soldiers of Christ turned landlords of a foreign land. The victory that had once seemed holy now demanded something harder than courage, governance. From the blood and dust of war rose the first Crusader states, fragile Christian enclaves carved deep into the heart of the Muslim world. The kingdom of Jerusalem became their crown, ruled by Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused a golden diadem. "I will not wear a crown of gold," he said, "where my Savior wore one of thorns." Yet humility could not hide the reality. They were conquerors governing the conquered. To the Franks, as the locals called them, the East was a land of both temptation and wonder. In its markets flowed perfumes, silks, spices, and languages their ears had never heard. The sun rose differently here, redder, nearer. The air was thick with call to prayer, a sound that haunted their mornings. They came to rule in the name of faith, but soon found themselves ruled by fascination. The culture they had feared began to shape them. Crusader knights learned Arabic words, copied Eastern architecture, and dined on foods their ancestors could not name. Even as enemies, East and West began to mirror each other. But beneath that uneasy harmony, tension never slept. To survive, the Crusader state became fortresses of faith, stone castles rising like islands in a sea of disbelief. Massive citadels such as Crac des Chevaliers and Carac towered over the landscape, their walls thick enough to resist armies and time. Each was both sanctuary and prison, protecting the few who held them, reminding the many who lived below, who now ruled their sky. The city of Jerusalem itself was remade into a Christian sanctuary. The Dome of the Rock became the Templum Domini, the Temple of the Lord. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was converted into stables and halls for a new kind of warrior monk, the Knights Templar. Clad in white robes marked by a red cross, they embodied a paradox: monks who prayed for peace and trained for war. Their lives were bound by vows of poverty and obedience, yet they commanded unimaginable power. The Templars were more than soldiers. They were the first great international order. They guarded pilgrims traveling the perilous road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, built fortresses along the coasts, and established banking systems that spanned continents. To deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Acre was a miracle as divine as any relic. To the world, they were holy knights. To the East, they were the mailed fist of Christendom, and to history, they would become legend, a brotherhood both revered and feared. Alongside them rose the Hospitallers, caretakers turned crusaders. Their mission began with healing, tending the wounded and sick who came to Jerusalem. But in a land that spoke only in the language of power, compassion needed armor. They, too, took up the sword. The sacred and the martial became indistinguishable. In this new world, mercy wore chainmail. For a time, peace, or something that resembled it, settled over the Holy Land. Trade resumed. Pilgrims arrived by the thousands, walking through gates that had once been guarded by blood. Latin churches gleamed beside old mosques. Frankish lords married local women. Children grew up speaking two languages, praying to one God under two names. The borders between East and West blurred, and for a moment it seemed that perhaps faith could coexist with the very world it had tried to conquer. But peace is a fragile illusion, especially when built upon conquest. The Crusader kings quarreled among themselves. Some sought alliances with neighboring Muslim rulers, preferring pragmatism to zeal. Others saw such truces as betrayal. The unity that had carried them to Jerusalem began to fracture, replaced by greed, suspicion, and the slow rot of comfort. The knights who once slept on bare ground now dined in marble halls. The dream of God's kingdom was fading into the politics of men. Beyond their walls, the Islamic world was stirring. From Aleppo to Damascus, new leaders emerged, men of faith and vision who looked upon Jerusalem's loss not as humiliation, but as a test. They saw the Crusader states for what they were, castles of sand waiting for the tide. In the mosques, preachers called for unity. The word jihad, whispered for decades, began to ring like a drumbeat. Still, in those early years, the Crusaders believed their work permanent. Pilgrims came and went, markets thrived, the walls stood strong. The church declared the experiment a success, God's will accomplished through human hands. Yet, in the silence of the night, under the stars above Jerusalem, perhaps even the holiest knights wondered what they had truly built. For a kingdom of God cannot survive on blood and fear alone. It must be fed by understanding, and understanding had been the first casualty of conquest. The East watched and waited. The West prayed and forgot. Between them, the Holy Land slept uneasily, the scent of incense and iron mingling in the wind. It would not be long before the dream began to crumble, not from outside attack at first, but from within. For faith, once turned into empire, always forgets the humility that made it sacred. And somewhere beyond the Jordan, a new name was being whispered, one that would soon burn itself into both Christian and Muslim memory, a man who would rise from the deserts and unite the crescent once more. His name was Saladin, and when he came, the kingdom of God would tremble. In the decades after Jerusalem's fall, the Muslim world seemed broken, a patchwork of rival cities, emirs, and sultans. But beneath the surface a current was stirring. The humiliation of losing the holy city had not extinguished faith. It had refined it. Across the mosques of Damascus and Cairo, sermons turned into rallying cries. Poets wrote of the blood that had watered the stones of Al-Quds, of the crescent dimmed but not lost. Slowly, across centuries of division, unity began to whisper again. It began in the north, in Mosul, with a ruler named Zengi, a man as feared as he was devout. Brutal, ambitious, and cunning, Zengi did what few thought possible. He reminded his people of a single truth, that while the Crusaders held the coast, Islam still held the heart of the land. In 1144, his armies surrounded Edessa, one of the four great Crusader states. The siege was swift and merciless. When the city fell, Europe was stunned. It was the first great Muslim victory of the crusading era, and it echoed across Christendom like thunder. In the West, the call went out for another holy war, the Second Crusade, led by kings themselves, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. But their campaign faltered before it began. Poorly led and divided by pride, the armies staggered through Anatolia and Syria, harried by Zengi's successors. By the time they reached Damascus, they were broken and disillusioned. The crusade that was meant to avenge Jerusalem ended in humiliation. The East had found its voice again. Out of that voice rose a name that would soon eclipse all others, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Born in Tikrit in 1137, Saladin's early life gave no sign of the legend he would become. He was quiet, scholarly, fond of poetry and philosophy, yet in him burned the same paradox that defines every great leader: humility in spirit, iron in purpose. He served first under his uncle, Shirkuh, a general of the great Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Aleppo and heir to Zengi's vision of unity. When Shirkuh died, Saladin inherited not just his army, but his calling. He rose not by ambition, but by faith and by patience. He did not seek power. He accepted it when others failed to use it well. In 1169, at only 31, he became vizier of Egypt, nominally under the Fatimid Caliphate, but quietly loyal to Nur ad-Din. The Fatimids were Shia, Saladin a Sunni, a division that could have destroyed him. Instead, he navigated it with tact and devotion. When the Fatimid dynasty finally ended, Egypt did not collapse. It transformed into the foundation of Saladin's new empire. In the years that followed, he worked not as a conqueror, but as a healer of divisions. He rebuilt mosques, funded schools, and called scholars to his court. His rule was disciplined, almost ascetic. He outlawed corruption, forgave debts, and gave charity in secret. He led prayers in person, shoulder to shoulder, with soldiers and beggars alike. His men said that when he smiled, they forgot they were afraid. When he prayed, they remembered why they fought. While the Crusaders fought among themselves, barons against barons, kings against vassals, Saladin built an army of faith. His banners bore verses from the Quran. His soldiers carried not just swords, but conviction. To the common man, he was no longer a sultan. He was a servant of God sent to restore dignity. In 1174, Nur ad-Din died unexpectedly, and the world held its breath. Many expected Saladin to fall. Instead, he rose higher. In a series of campaigns, he united Egypt and Syria under one rule. Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, the great cities of Islam once again spoke the same name in their Friday prayers. The crescent was whole again, and its light pointed toward Jerusalem. In the Crusader castles, word of Saladin's rise spread like rumor, then like dread. The knights who had once laughed at disorganized foes now faced an empire led by a man both warrior and philosopher. He wrote letters of mercy to his enemies and waged war with precision. His soldiers spoke of dreams in which the prophet himself rode beside him. The chroniclers in Europe, who called Muslims infidels without faces, began to write of this one with respect. Even those who would one day fight him could not deny his grace. The moment of reckoning came in 1187 at a place called Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders, led by Guy of Lusignan, marched out to meet Saladin under a scorching July sun. They carried the true cross, the relic believed to hold a fragment of Christ's crucifixion. They expected God to fight for them. Instead, they met the patience of strategy. Saladin's forces surrounded them, cutting them off from water. The heat did the rest. When the Christian army collapsed from thirst and exhaustion, Saladin struck. The battle lasted hours, but its outcome was eternal. The true cross was captured, the Crusader army annihilated. Only a handful survived. When King Guy was brought before him trembling, Saladin offered him water, a gesture of mercy. When Reynald of Chatillon, notorious for massacring pilgrims, refused to repent, Saladin personally struck him down. To his soldiers, it was justice. To his enemies, it was restraint. For though he could have slaughtered every captive, he did not. Mercy was his victory's signature. With Hatton won, the road to Jerusalem lay open. That autumn, the city that had burned in 1099 now waited in fear. But Saladin did not come as the Franks had. When Jerusalem surrendered, he entered peacefully. No massacres, no desecration. The Christian inhabitants were allowed to ransom their freedom. The poor were freed outright. The cross was lowered from the dome, but the city did not bleed this time. When Saladin entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque, he knelt in prayer, where others had once prayed for his death. The chroniclers of both worlds agreed. In that moment, the balance had been restored. The crescent had answered the cross not with vengeance, but with dignity. Even in Europe, tales of Saladin's chivalry spread like light. To his enemies, he was the perfect knight. To his people, he was the restorer of justice. To history, he was the answer to a prayer whispered beneath centuries of blood. But victory, like faith, is never permanent. Across the sea in the courts of kings and cardinals, another wind was rising, this time led by a lion whose roar would echo across the same sands. His name was Richard, and he was coming. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the news crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, and struck Europe like thunder. In cathedrals from London to Rome, priests wept openly. The holiest city, won by miracle, had been lost again. Kings swore oaths before the altar. Banners of the cross unfurled across Christendom once more. This would be no simple campaign. It would be the mightiest crusade yet. And at its heart stood three kings whose names would echo through legend: Richard, the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Barbarossa, the old emperor, led first, a giant of a man, his armor gleaming red under the Anatolian sun. But fate is cruel to age. Crossing a mountain river, he fell from his horse and drowned. His army, struck by despair, disbanded. 1/3 of the crusade ended before it began. Philip and Richard continued by sea, sailing across the Mediterranean in vast fleets that turned the horizon white with sails. They landed first in Acre, a fortress city now held by Saladin's men. What began as a siege became a nightmare. For 2 years, crusaders from every corner of Europe surrounded Acre's walls, enduring plague, hunger, and heat. Corpses piled so high they formed walls of their own. Yet within that hell, Richard emerged, fierce, restless, and brilliant. He was everything the age adored and feared, fearless in battle, merciless in strategy, but also cultured, educated, capable of poetry and prayer in equal measure. When his men faltered, he fought among them. When they despaired, he sang to them. The chroniclers wrote that his courage shone like the sun through the smoke. And when Acre finally fell in 1191, Richard's fame burned brighter than any king alive. Yet the victory came at a cost. Thousands of Muslim prisoners, promised ransom, remained within the walls. Saladin delayed payment, hoping to buy time. Richard, fearing betrayal and impatience of his men, ordered their execution. On a field outside Acre, 3,000 captives were slain, their cries carried by the sea wind. Even those who loved Richard would never forget it. Even Saladin, upon hearing it, lowered his head in silence. For both men, the war had now become personal. What followed was a campaign of genius and exhaustion. Saladin's armies shadowed Richard's every move, striking, vanishing, reforming like smoke. The Franks pushed south toward Jaffa, the key to Jerusalem. At Arsuf, they met in open battle. It was the clash of civilizations distilled into a single day. Saladin's cavalry swept in waves, their arrows darkening the air. The Crusaders, disciplined behind their shields, waited until Richard gave a single command, then charged like thunder. The Muslim lines broke under the shock of armored knights and mounted lances. For the first time, Saladin himself faltered, retreating to preserve his army. Richard had won, but the victory brought him no closer to peace. For every city taken, another was lost. For every victory, a new stalemate. The two commanders seemed bound by fate, mirror images, separated by faith. Saladin prayed 5 times a day, even on campaign, never allowing rage to cloud his mercy. Richard confessed his sins before battle, believing his cause divine, but his soul imperfect. They never met in person, yet through messengers they exchanged gifts and respect. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him snow from Mount Lebanon to cool his fever, a gesture that stunned both armies. The two men, born enemies, recognized in each other something rarer than victory: honor. By 1192, both were exhausted. Jerusalem lay within reach, yet also beyond reason. Richard could take the city, but not hold it. Saladin could defend it, but at the cost of its empire. Their armies, once roaring, now moved like ghosts. Men whispered that even the angels were weary. So the Lion and the Crescent sat across the desert from one another, and for the first time in the history of the Crusades, two sides chose words over slaughter. Their truce, signed near Ramla, was simple but profound. Christians would keep the coastal cities, Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre. Pilgrims would be free to visit Jerusalem without fear. The holy city itself would remain under Muslim rule, but open to all who came in peace. Neither side had won. Both had preserved what truly mattered. Richard prepared to return home, his health failing, his kingdom in rebellion. Before leaving, he sent word to Saladin, "If I must lose my city, I would wish it to fall to no one but you." Saladin smiled when he heard this. "If I must lose my city," he replied, "I would wish it to be taken by no one but him." Two men who had fought for heaven met at last on earth, not in hatred, but in understanding. When Richard sailed from Acre, he looked back at the coast where so many dreams had burned. He had come seeking a crown of glory and left with something quieter: wisdom. He had learned that victory could not conquer faith, and faith could not erase humanity. Across the desert, Saladin knelt in prayer within Jerusalem's walls, the call to prayer echoing through the same streets that had once run with blood. The city breathed again, scarred, yet sacred still. Months later, Saladin would die in Damascus, his empire united, but his treasury nearly empty. He had given his wealth to the poor. When they opened his tomb, they found only a single gold coin and the shroud he was buried in. A herald carried his banner through the streets, crying out, "This is all that remains of the conqueror of kingdoms." Richard would die years later in France, shot by a crossbow during a petty siege far from Jerusalem. His heart, removed and preserved, was buried separately, a relic of a man who had loved war more than peace and faith more than himself. The Third Crusade ended not in triumph, but in revelation that holiness cannot be seized by the sword, and that sometimes the greatest victory lies in restraint. For a brief moment, amid the dust and ruin, two men had shown the world what honor looked like, and then vanished into history. Their story would live forever. The lion who roared for God, and the servant who knelt for him, each chasing heaven across the same desert. When Richard and Saladin's truce rippled across the Mediterranean, Europe breathed again. But the breath was shallow. For all their vows and bloodshed, the holy city remained beyond Christian hands. Pilgrims could walk its streets, yes, but only under Muslim watch. The church declared this a blessing. Knights whispered it was failure. The dream of the First Crusade, of Jerusalem as a Christian kingdom, was slipping away. Yet power, once tasted, never leaves quietly. The fires of faith that had burned white-hot began to flicker red, fueled now by envy, pride, and the hunger of kings. In the years that followed, the crusading spirit did not die. It decayed. What had begun as a pilgrimage of the soul became an enterprise of profit. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was meant to strike at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power. But armies are fragile things when guided by debt. The Crusaders, unable to pay the Venetian merchants who built their fleets, were persuaded into a new target. Not Muslim Alexandria, but Christian Zara, a rival port city. When they sacked it, Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire army. And yet they marched on, no longer soldiers of God, but mercenaries of convenience. Then came the unthinkable. Venice, ever the traitor, whispered a new promise. If the Crusaders would help place a claimant upon the throne of Byzantium, they could pay their debts in gold. The plan twisted itself into history's cruelest irony. The army of Christ turned against Christendom's own heart. In 1204, they stormed Constantinople, the greatest Christian city on earth. For 3 days, the capital of the Eastern Empire burned. Churches were looted, relics stolen, nuns and priests dragged into the streets. Horses were stabled in the Hagia Sophia, the most sacred cathedral of the East. When the smoke cleared, the cross still hung over the city, but it was smeared with ash and blood. The Crusaders had captured no holy land, won no victory for God. They had instead broken the last bridge between the Eastern and Western worlds. The schism between Orthodox and Catholic would never heal. The Holy War had devoured its own faith. Still, the Church tried to reclaim the spirit. There would be more crusades. The Children's Crusade, where thousands of young boys and girls set out for the Holy Land, believing the sea itself would part for their innocence. None returned. Some were sold into slavery, others starved along the roads. The Fifth Crusade struck Egypt again, but drowned in the Nile's floods. The Sixth, led by Frederick II, tried diplomacy and miraculously succeeded. Without bloodshed, he negotiated control of Jerusalem for a brief, shining decade. Yet the Pope, mistrusting him, excommunicated him anyway. Even victory could not escape suspicion. Each generation tried to revive the cross, and each found it heavier to bear. By the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, led by the saintly Louis IX of France, the fire had turned to embers. Louis, noble and sincere, believed he could cleanse the sins of his age by reclaiming the Holy Land. Instead, he died of disease outside the walls of Tunis, whispering prayers into the desert wind. His body, carried home in salt, became the last relic of an era's faith. Meanwhile, the world changed around the Crusaders' ruins. The Islamic empires they had once terrorized evolved. New dynasties rose in Egypt and Syria, building upon Saladin's foundation. Trade between East and West flourished again, but it was merchants now, not monks, who crossed the seas. From the ashes of conflict came the birth of exchange. Spices, silk, science, mathematics, and medicine flowing into Europe's ports. The same roads once trampled by war horses now carried caravans of knowledge. Out of the Crusades' failure emerged something unexpected, the first glimmer of the Renaissance. But for the people who lived through it, there was no poetry in their pain. Villages still bore scars of taxation. Families mourned sons who never returned. The church grew rich from indulgences, while faith among the poor turned hollow. The Holy Land itself became weary of foreign saviors. The castles of the Templars stood empty, their flags torn by sand and time. And then one final reckoning came. The Mamluks, fierce warrior slaves who had risen to rule Egypt, began a relentless campaign. One by one, the remaining Crusader strongholds fell. Acre, Tripoli, Antioch. In 1291, 2 centuries after Pope Urban's first cry, the last Crusader city on the Levantine coast fell to the sword. The defenders fought to the last man, the sea red with their blood. When the smoke cleared, the dream was over. There were no more kings left to answer the call. The Holy Land belonged again to its own people. Back in Europe, silence followed. The cross still hung in churches, but it no longer commanded armies. The songs of crusade faded into legend. Only the relics remained, splinters of the true cross, shards of armor, bones of nameless martyrs. Each told a story that none dared repeat aloud, that faith without wisdom becomes fire without warmth. And yet, even in defeat, something eternal had survived, the yearning itself. The need to find meaning beyond the sword, to believe that suffering could still sanctify. From that yearning, a different kind of pilgrimage began, inward this time, into the heart of man rather than across deserts. The Crusades had ended, but the war for heaven within the human soul was only just beginning. When the last Crusader banners fell at Acre, the sea wind carried them away like ashes. 2 centuries of holy war ended not with trumpets, but with silence, the same silence that follows the collapse of great belief, a silence full of questions. What had it all meant? What had been won, and what had been lost? The kings and popes who once spoke of eternal glory were gone. But the people, the craftsmen, the widows, the children who had prayed for their father's return, they were left to live in the long shadow of that silence. Europe had changed. The continent that had marched east in poverty and zeal returned home bruised, wiser, and strangely restless. The Crusades had opened the world, and with it, the imagination. Pilgrims brought back more than relics. They brought ideas. From the libraries of the East came forgotten texts of Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen. From Damascus and Baghdad came new sciences, astronomy, algebra, medicine. From the markets of Cairo and Antioch came silk, sugar, and stories. Europe, long asleep in its cloisters, awoke to find itself hungry for knowledge. In the wreckage of holy war, the seeds of the Renaissance had been sown. And yet, for all this awakening, the soul of Europe remained haunted. The Crusader's sword had cut deep, not only into the lands of others, but into its own conscience. In village churches, the songs of crusade turned to laments. Bards no longer sang of glory, but of waste, of bones bleaching under desert suns, of kings dying far from home. The holy war that was meant to unite Christendom had left it fractured. The Eastern and Western churches, once divided only by theology, were now enemies by memory. Constantinople's smoking ruins stood as the gravestone of Christian unity. Even the knightly orders, once symbols of sanctity and courage, began to fall from grace. The Knights Templar, richest and most powerful among them, had grown into an empire of their own. Their castles dotted Europe, their treasuries rivaled kings. But wealth invites envy, and mystery breeds fear. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templars, struck a deal with the Pope and struck them down. At dawn on a Friday, October 13th, hundreds of knights were arrested, accused of heresy, idolatry, and secret rites. Under torture, they confessed to anything demanded. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive on the banks of the Seine. As the flames rose, witnesses swore he cursed both Pope and King, summoning them to meet him before God within a year. Within 12 months, both were dead. Thus ended the brotherhood that had once guarded the roads to Jerusalem. The Church, once their protector, had become their pyre. The Holy Land itself, freed from European rule, returned to a rhythm older than empire. The mosques repaired their domes, the bazaars reopened, and the call to prayer rose once more over Jerusalem. The city had learned endurance. It had seen prophets and conquerors, kings and zealots, all pass like storms. And still it stood. For those who prayed within its walls, the lesson was eternal. No one owns the sacred. They can only borrow it. But though the Crusades had ended, their echo did not. The idea of a holy mission, of violence wrapped in virtue, had seeped into Western veins. The same language that once called men to Jerusalem would later call them to conquer new worlds. The infidel simply changed face, from Saracen to heretic, from pagan to native. When ships set sail for the Americas centuries later, their captains carried not only flags and cannon, but the old conviction that God himself favored expansion. The Crusades had died as wars, but survived as mentality. In art and literature they became myth. Poets romanticized them. Painters sanctified them. The suffering and slaughter were softened into symbols of courage. In Paris, troubadours sang of chivalry. In Venice, merchants spoke of honor and profit in the same breath. The stories of Richard and Saladin became moral fables. The noble enemies, each reflecting what the other lacked. To Christians, Saladin became the Saracen gentleman. To Muslims, Richard the honest but misguided knight. Their rivalry turned to legend, a tale less about conquest than about mutual recognition, the rare moment when war gave birth to respect. For scholars, the Crusades became paradox. They had failed utterly in their stated goal, to secure Jerusalem for Christendom, yet succeeded in transforming the very civilization that launched them. They brought East and West into dialogue, however unwilling, and in that exchange lay the birth of the modern world. The mathematical instruments of Arab navigators would guide European ships. The medical texts of Andalusia would shape universities from Paris to Padua. The very compass that led crusaders home would one day lead explorers to new continents. Still, memory carries guilt like a scar. In monasteries, theologians argued whether such wars had ever been holy at all. Some called them divine tests. Others whispered that they had been humanity's gravest sin. "If we kill in God's name," wrote one monk, "do we not make him the author of our hate?" But history rarely offers absolution, only reflection. The Crusades had taught Europe that faith without compassion becomes tyranny, and that conquest without understanding breeds only emptiness. And yet, in the same breath, they had taught resilience, the capacity of belief to evolve. Out of the ruins of certainty came curiosity. Out of guilt came grace. Out of isolation came connection. The men who had once ridden to war now sent their sons to study Arabic astronomy, Greek philosophy, and Hebrew law. Slowly, painfully, the walls between civilizations began to crack. The very borders drawn in blood became bridges for thought. Jerusalem, meanwhile, continued its quiet vigil. Pilgrims still came, Christians, Jews, Muslims, their prayers rising like different notes of the same hymn. The stones remembered everything. The city had been heaven's battlefield, but now it was simply holy because it endured. The Crusades had begun as a quest to claim it for God. They ended by revealing that God needed no claiming. By the 14th century, the last Crusader castles stood as relics of a forgotten world. Vines climbed their walls. Owls nested in their towers. Travelers from Europe still gazed upon them with awe, not as triumphs, but as reminders. To stand among their ruins was to feel both the grandeur and the futility of human passion. The echo of swords had faded, but the questions they raised still lingered in the wind. Can holiness be owned? Can heaven be conquered? Can men ever fight for peace? In the centuries that followed, those questions would shape empires, revolutions, and faith itself. The Crusades, though buried in time, had changed the way humanity saw both God and itself. They revealed the double-edged nature of belief, capable of creation as vast as cathedrals and destruction as total as fire. And perhaps that was their final gift, not victory, not redemption, but awareness that within every human heart lives both the pilgrim and the crusader, both the seeker and the conqueror. The story of the Crusades was not just history. It was prophecy, a warning echoing across ages, reminding us that every holy war begins not in heaven, but in the silence where men decide what God desires. Centuries have passed since the banners of the cross and crescent faced one another beneath the sun of Palestine. The castles are dust, the swords rusted, the bones of kings long forgotten. Yet the memory endures, not as flame, but as echo. The Crusades were not a single war, but a mirror held to humanity's oldest struggle, the yearning to touch heaven and the blindness that follows when we reach with bloodied hands. In their wake, the world became larger. Out of violence came vision. The same faith that once marched in armor would, in time, build universities, cathedrals, and observatories. The sciences born from Islamic cities would seed Europe's rebirth. The very languages once divided by Scripture would cross-pollinate in the pages of philosophy. Faith, having fought for land, began instead to seek understanding. The holy fire that once burned cities now illuminated minds. But the ghosts of that age never truly vanished. In every century since, the word crusade has returned, reshaped by politics, nationalism, and pride. Its shadow lingers in every war fought under the banner of righteousness, every empire that calls its mission divine. The lesson, whispered through history's ruins, is always the same. That belief, without humility, becomes its own idol. And yet, something beautiful survived. Out of centuries of war rose a quiet reverence, an unspoken recognition that holiness cannot be owned, only honored. Pilgrims still walk the same dusty roads, some carrying crosses, others prayer beads, all seeking what the soldiers could not find: peace within themselves. Jerusalem remains, not conquered, not lost, but eternal, a city of faith and memory, where three prayers rise into one sky. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Crusades, not the kingdoms built or broken, not the victories written in blood, but the understanding that heaven was never meant to be seized by the sword. It lives instead in the human heart, fragile, stubborn, and forever reaching upward. The cross and the crescent remain side by side, their shadows intertwined upon the same ancient stones, reminding us that the road to God was never meant to lead through war, but through remembrance. And so, the story closes not with triumph, but with silence, the same silence that began it all, a silence deep enough to hold both faith and doubt, loss and revelation, the silence of men who went to war for paradise, and returned if they returned at all, having found that paradise was never somewhere else, it was always here,